With Attack on Titan Final Season Part 3 First Half kicking things off with a bang, even if the season's naming scheme is becoming absolutely ridiculous, I got to wondering. With the Alliance and Marlean attempting, and at least so far failing to stop the rumbling, could our modern weapons and militaries achieve what they have failed to do thus far in the show with their roughly World War I technology? Hello and welcome you beautiful people. So then, a few things to establish before we get to the meat of the video. Chiefly, what is the rumbling, how do we stop it, and what am I basing my assumptions on, since there are a lot of assumptions and educated guesses in this video due to a lot of military and weapons information being, well, classified. Starting off with that first question, what is the rumbling? It is the founding Titans' way of threatening the world with global genocide should anyone attack its people. It's a wall of colossal titans marching across the land, crushing everything beneath its feet, ending any and all threats to the Eldian people. In this regard, the most important thing to consider is how many titans are we actually talking about, aka how many titans do we need to kill? Well, I found a lot of conflicting numbers when looking online. Some state millions or even tens of millions, but given that the walls were built around the year 1800 with a far smaller world population than what we have today, for example, I find it hard to believe that the founding Titan would sacrifice most of its people just to protect the few percent that remain human. So we're going with a more sensible number of 585,000 that seems to be floating around, and for convenience sake I'll round that up to 600,000. Okay, now that we've established what and how many do we need to kill, there remains an important question of how do we actually go about killing them in the first place. Well, like any other Titan, the Wall Titans have some form of their original human body in the nape of their necks. The manga is a bit unclear on this one, but it seems like they have either a part of the brain, the spinal column, or both located there, and destroying this will kill the Titan. But that isn't actually the only way. Now, hear me out on this one. It seems like you don't need to destroy the nape itself, at least not directly, and we have seen the Allied Navy achieve some kills without nape hits. We saw them shred apart some of the Wall Titans, resulting in their sundered bodies sinking to the bottom of the ocean, which would cause the pressure to crush them entirely, especially since the Titan bones and flesh are nowhere near as dense as even ours. Therefore, sinking deep enough undoubtedly results in the Titan dying. So we have two ways of killing them: destroy the nape or blow them apart when they're crossing deep bodies of water. Incidentally, I'm ignoring the potential of killing Eren being the key to stopping the rumbling, since that would just make this trivial. And finally, the last question. What am I basing my assumption of our weapon capabilities on? Now, I am by no means a military or weapons expert, and I have no access to the largely classified data. But I am a military enthusiast, and I find the devices we've created to kill one another infinitely fascinating, if equally terrifying. And as such, I've accumulated knowledge on the topic using various mostly internet sources such as Jane's, and that knowledge is what I'm basing this video on. Also, for the ease of looking at it, I'm passing by our current geopolitical issues, then assuming that under the threat of global genocide, we too, like the allied nations in Attack on Titan, would form an alliance and prepare for the worst, before the assault on Paradise even began. And the time to prepare we have is roughly a month, as stated in the latest episode. Now, this time to prepare, coupled with our vastly superior tactical mobility when compared to the allies in the show, is the reason why I'm assuming we will be able to bring to bear whatever we want, at least at some point during the Rumbling's march, and as such I'm not really considering logistics issues here. Still, keep in mind that this is just a fun little thought exercise, and I am bound to get some things wrong, and if you think you've spotted holes in my logic, do let me know in the comments below, as I'm really interested in hearing what other people think. So then, finally, let's get down to business. Could we stop the rumbling? The simple answer to that is, well, yes, and the slightly more detailed answer is also yes, but with, surprise surprise, a little bit more detail. And it goes something like this. While our modern doctrine would not include a full-blown airborne assault on Paradise, and instead we'd send Spec Ops to eliminate Eren and key figures, but ignoring that, let's assume that like in the show the Spec Ops fail and the rumbling starts, and that is where we get our first proper difference. With our scout drones and satellites, we would immediately know that it has begun and react accordingly. Therefore, a minute or so later, depending on launch location and flight time, we would wipe Paradise and everything on it off the face of the Earth in nuclear fire. and well, job's done, rumbling over, and we can all go home in time for tea and medals. But since that isn't really a fun thought exercise, I figured every time we stop the rumbling, I'd eliminate the weapon system that managed to do it, and see how far down the ladder we go until our modern weapons would fail us. So then, no nukes, what do we do? Well, a reaction would still be almost imminent, if less devastating, as we would launch our non-nuclear long-range options. ICBMs with conventional warheads and cruise missiles like T-LAMs and other long-range missiles various countries have in their arsenals. But there are a few problems with these. First of all, weapons such as the T-LAM, which I'm using as an example to make this a bit simpler, aren't generally designed for the kind of accuracy that would be needed to achieve a kill on every hit, and there aren't actually that many of them. Unsurprisingly, accurate numbers are impossible to gauge, but some wild estimates, I'd say 100 to 200,000 missiles, especially counting things like anti-shipping missiles as well, since radar should be able to lock onto the wall titans. But this number is a very rough estimate of the number of missiles we'd roughly have. But with the accuracy issues, I'd say with a little luck and accounting to simply felling titans leading them to being trampled by the titans that come after them, we might get some tens of thousands of kills before the rumbling would reach the sea. After all, they're very densely packed. So let's say best case scenario and put that number to 50k. Okay, now 550,000 mountains of meat are still swimming in the oceans. How does one continue to prosecute them? At sea, we would do what the Allied Navy did and try to sink as many as we could, but unlike the Allies, we wouldn't stand in the path of the Titans like idiots, but instead strike from a distance, most likely using our ASM weapons since the Titans don't actually swim on the surface. Here we would have a higher hit-to-kill ratio than with the long-range missiles, but weapons themselves are slower, and we'd probably get to around the same region of 50-odd thousand kills. So then, 100k down, 500,000 more to go. What do? We can't exactly torpedo them on the ground, and we're out of missiles. Do we just stand in a line and shoot them with artillery pieces like Marley did? Well, no, at least not initially. Instead, we use the most overpowered thing in our arsenal besides nuclear weapons against a threat like the rumbling: air supremacy. Both fixed and rotary-wing aircraft would strike with all precision-guided munitions we collectively possess, assuming in a world of Titans people would have invented guidance systems to specifically target the nape, and even if not, laser and Saklos-guided weapons would still be more than sufficient. With these weapons, the key is in the name. Unlike the long-range options and anti-shipping missiles we had, these weapons are more than accurate enough to hit the nape exactly, but let's say with a margin of error of maybe 80% of the time it's one shot, one kill, and with a massive amount of precision weapons from bombs to missiles to even laser-guided rockets, the number of munitions wouldn't really be a problem here. And before someone mentions it, no, monkey throwing rocks isn't really a problem here either. Unlike for the Marlean airships, we have stupid range advantage to a point where the only thing he could hope for is hitting and destroying some of the incoming munitions, hence the relatively high margin of error. And also, no, the heat the Titans produce would also be a non-issue. It isn't actually all that hot, and most of these munitions are traveling several hundred meters a second, simply not leaving enough time for the heat to affect them. Now, upon researching this a bit, I've discovered that A, air supremacy is stupidly overpowered against the rumbling, as even dumb bombs with CCIP are more than precise enough to take the Titans down without a real threat of casualties, outside of maybe accidents when flying in a very populated airspace, and B, the Titans are actually surprisingly weak to our modern weapons. Hell, we could just use the guns and cannons on our aerial assets to end the rumbling nice and easy, although it would take longer and the risk of rocks would be higher. And now, like with the nukes, let's assume we don't have access to air power. Do we all just fail and die trampled by Titans? And once again, the answer to that is no. We are still keeping the long-range missiles and torpedo attacks as they were unable to stop the rumbling on their own, and therefore we are back in square one. 500,000 odd Titans have landed. How do we go about stopping them? Well, unlike from the air, I doubt anti-tank guided missiles launched from the ground would be very effective, as they'd have to hit the Titans pretty much from the front, and they aren't exactly designed to pierce through a few meters of flesh to destroy the nape. But we'll come back to these weapons in a bit. To stop the rumbling on the ground, we might actually rely on a tactic not too dissimilar to what the Marlean artillery wall tried, but with a slightly bigger safety margin and more efficiency. You see, we have these things called wheeled and tracked vehicles with the mobility and accuracy to move ahead of the wall of flesh and take them down one by one. But I hear you cry, "Cheese, you just said that anti-tank weapons wouldn't be effective against the Titans." Yes, so I did. But that is only true with chemical effect munitions such as safe charges, which the aforementioned ATGMs rely on. The thing with the Titans is that their flesh and bones aren't dense enough to even support their upright posture without the cause reasons, anime logic, and we've already seen this in effect when Marley used an anti-Titan cannon to shoot clean through Eren's Titan form with little resistance. And if a World War I cannon can do that, our modern kinetic penetrators wouldn't have an issue striking clean through the front of a colossal Titan all the way to the back and destroying the nape from the front. And they have the accuracy to boot. But assuming on the move we'd be looking at maybe a kill in 3 or 4 shots, which I think is still pretty harsh given that the machines like, say the Type 10 for example, have an average deviation of 5 centimeters at 1,000 meters for its shots, but we'll roll with it to even out some of the older vehicles in the mix. And honestly, I think even kinetic ammunition firing autocannons would be more than enough to kill the Titans just with a few more shots. Now, I feel it's important to mention that, surprise surprise, there is no flesh penetration data available for anti-armor munitions, since we don't generally shoot mountains of meat with them, but given the low density, I doubt there would be enough resistance to plasticize the shell, which is what happens when an APFSDS fails to penetrate, and the possible deviation when flying through the Titan is also accounted in the 3 to 4 shots per kill. Now, this is something where I again ran into a bit of a numbers issue. There is an estimate that the world has a little over 70,000 active tanks, but tanks are not the only thing we could use here. There is also things like wheeled fire support vehicles like the Type 16, the Centauro, the Striker MGS, the list goes on and on. And on top of that, we'd also have to count in the aforementioned autocannon armed vehicles like IFVs. Accounting for everything, I'm going to throw a very wild guesstimate of around 300,000 vehicles capable of dropping a War Titan, and thus this again becomes a turkey shoot, with most modern vehicles being able to reload their main armament in well under 10 seconds. But moving on to the last ground-based option we would have. Assuming we couldn't bring all those big tank guns to bear, we could do what Marley did and support our direct fire platforms with indirect fire and missiles, but use them smartly. Given that these guns are relatively small when compared to the big naval guns on the Allied Navy, I'd say we could not rip the Titans apart as easily as those huge high explosive shells did, but the increased accuracy provided by more modern systems, we could quite easily target the knees and legs of the Titans and use the rumbling against itself. Like with the long-range missile strikes in the opening moments of the conflict, bringing down a Titan would lead to it being trampled and subsequently killed by those coming after it. But with the line not being infinitely thick, this alone wouldn't stop the rumbling, but then we'd just simply rely on our direct fire killing methods to mop up the stragglers. But if we then further remove all big gun vehicles, we are pretty screwed. Maybe we could amass enough static guns to bring down every single Titan given our massive range advantage and just hammer them to the ground until we've turned every square meter into minced meat, but without the advantage of being more mobile and if necessary outrunning the Titans. This would mean we only have so long to do it, and I'd say it might be a 50-50. On one hand, we have a massive number of guns at our disposal, with Finland alone possessing close to 2,000 artillery pieces of varying sizes and ranges, and my nation is only a drop in the ocean compared to some of the bigger players in terms of militaries. But on the other hand, the Titans move at around 50 kilometers an hour, not giving us that long to hit them, so this is a maybe. And needless to say, infantry alone couldn't really do that much to the Titans. Maybe take down a few by targeting their legs and getting them to be crushed by the others, but yeah, no. So then, with all being said and done, could we stop the rumbling? Well, yes, many times over in fact, and without much of a sweat and with surprisingly few casualties. Even when robbed of our most effective weapons, we would still have a myriad fallback options to do what the Alliance failed to do in the show, showing just how far we as a species have come in a mere 100 years in the weapons department, and well, it's like they say, nothing feeds innovation quite like our desire to horrendously murder one another, and as sad as that may be, it really shows. Finally, before I go, this video has no connection to any current world events. I am not glorifying war, and while I like militaria and find weapon systems interesting, I do not in any way condone the use of such devices unless for defensive purposes. I simply wanted to combine two things I like, those being anime and representation of militaria in a fictional context, into a fun video using some of my admittedly limited expertise in the latter. Now, with the disclaimers being done, Titans slain and the thought exercise being over, do let me know what you think. Did I get something wrong? Were my assumptions too general and the numbers all over the place? I'd also appreciate if you provided information on why you think I'm wrong. Like this video if you liked it, dislike if you didn't, subscribe for more anime goodness, and check the links in the description if you want to engage with me outside of YouTube. With this, I have been Cheese, and I hope to see you next time. Ta-ta for now.